The saga of Jeffrey Edward Epstein represents one of the most sprawling, systematic, and heavily scrutinized criminal conspiracies in modern judicial history. Spanning over 2 decades, Epstein's operation weaponized vast wealth and high society connections to facilitate the serial sexual abuse and trafficking of minors. This is not merely the story of a single predator. It is an exhaustive look at the systemic failures, the legal loopholes, and the eventual reckoning that shook the global elite. The investigation into Jeffrey Epstein is a multi-jurisdictional labyrinth that exposes the vulnerabilities of the American justice system when confronted with extreme wealth. Operating primarily between his residences in Palm Beach, Florida, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, Epstein and his associates, most notably British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell, utilized a pyramid-style entourage model to exploit vulnerable teenage girls. These victims were lured under the guise of providing massages, which invariably escalated into sexual abuse. To insulate himself from direct recruitment, Epstein weaponized his wealth, paying victims hundreds of dollars in cash to recruit their peers, thereby creating a buffer of victim recruiters. The legal reckoning for this enterprise began in March 2005. The Palm Beach Police Department, under the leadership of Chief Michael Ryder, launched an investigation following a complaint from the family of a 14-year-old girl. Despite local detectives uncovering dozens of victims and establishing a clear pattern of serial abuse, the local prosecution stalled. Palm Beach State Attorney Barry Krischer aggressively minimized the case, taking the unusual step of sending it to a state grand jury rather than filing direct charges, resulting in a single, minor state charge of soliciting prostitution. Frustrated by the local stonewalling, PBPD leadership referred the case to the FBI, launching a federal probe dubbed Operation Leap Year. By 2007, federal prosecutors had drafted a comprehensive 60-count indictment. However, the pursuit of justice was subverted by an unprecedented legal maneuver. U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta brokered a secret non-prosecution agreement, or NPA, with Epstein's formidable defense team. The NPA granted Epstein and his unnamed co-conspirators sweeping federal immunity in the Southern District of Florida. In exchange, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state prostitution charges, served a mere 13 months of an 18-month sentence in a private county jail wing, and was granted extensive work release privileges. Crucially, the Department of Justice later confirmed that the victims were unlawfully kept in the dark about this agreement, a direct violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. For 10 years, Epstein resumed his life among the global elite. It was not until November 2018, spurred by the Miami Herald's investigative series, Perversion of Justice, that public outrage forced a re-examination of the 2007 NPA. On July 6, 2019, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York arrested Epstein on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. Weeks later, on August 10, 2019, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. While the New York City Medical Examiner and the DOJ Office of the Inspector General officially ruled the death as suicide by hanging, catastrophic guard negligence, and missing security footage birthed rampant public speculation and conspiracy theories. Though Epstein's death precluded a criminal trial, accountability shifted to his enablers. In July 2020, the FBI arrested Ghislaine Maxwell. Following a highly publicized trial, a jury convicted Maxwell in December 2021 of 5 counts, including the sex trafficking of a minor. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Simultaneously, survivors and the government of the U.S. Virgin Islands targeted the financial architecture that sustained the abuse. Civil litigation yielded historic settlements. Epstein's estate paid $105 million to the Virgin Islands and $121 million directly to 135 survivors through a compensation fund. J.P. Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank, accused of ignoring glaring red flags to retain Epstein's lucrative accounts, settled lawsuits for a combined $440 million. The final act of the Epstein saga materialized via legislative mandate. In November 2025, the U.S. Congress passed and President Donald Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. This law forced the DOJ to unseal millions of pages of investigative materials. On January 30th, 2026, the DOJ released 3.5 million pages of unredacted flight logs, emails, and interview transcripts. This final disclosure exposed the complicity of powerful figures worldwide, leading to the immediate resignation of international executives, triggering new corruption investigations, and forever altering the landscape of corporate and political accountability. To dismantle a criminal empire, investigators must first map the origins of its architect. Jeffrey Epstein's rise from a middle-class upbringing to the apex of global wealth remains shrouded in financial opacity. His ascent was fueled by charm, aggressive salesmanship, and an uncanny ability to ingratiate himself with billionaires who sought absolute financial discretion. Born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, to a middle-class Jewish family, Epstein demonstrated early signs of prodigious intelligence. He skipped 2 grades and graduated high school at 16. Despite his academic aptitude, he dropped out of NYU's Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences in 1974 without earning a degree. Yet, lacking a college degree didn't stop him. His intelligence and charm secured him a position teaching calculus and physics at the Dalton School, an elite prep school on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Though dismissed in 1976 for poor performance, his time at Dalton provided crucial networking opportunities among the parents of his wealthy students. Pivoting to Wall Street in 1976, Epstein joined Bear Stearns. By 1980, he was featured as Cosmopolitan magazine's Bachelor of the Month. He soon founded his own firm specializing in tracking down embezzled funds for wealthy clients, eventually establishing J. Epstein & Company, a private wealth management firm that ostensibly required clients to have a minimum net worth of $1 billion. But the true catalyst for Epstein's billionaire status was retail magnate Leslie H. Wexner, the CEO of L Brands, the parent company of Victoria's Secret. In the late 1980s, Epstein became Wexner's closest financial advisor. Wexner granted Epstein an extraordinarily broad power of attorney, allowing Epstein unfettered access to manage his vast fortune, acquire prime real estate, and establish complex trust structures. This relationship provided Epstein with massive financial resources and an aura of unimpeachable respectability. Wexner formally severed ties with Epstein in 2007 following the initial criminal charges, claiming Epstein had misappropriated tens of millions of dollars. The true currency of Epstein's empire was not money, but access. Epstein meticulously cultivated a social network that bridged politics, academia, finance, and entertainment. This network was documented in his personal contact directory, notoriously known as the Little Black Book, and the extensive flight logs of his private aircraft. First surfacing in a 2009 courtroom, the Little Black Book was an annotated directory maintained by Epstein's staff. Totaling 97 pages, it contained 1,571 names, roughly 5,000 phone numbers, and thousands of email addresses. In 2009, Epstein's former butler attempted to sell the book for $50,000, calling it his insurance against Epstein. Then there were the flight logs. Epstein's private aircraft, famously dubbed the Lolita Express, were heavily tracked by investigators. Logs unsealed during the Ghislaine Maxwell trial and U.S. Customs and Border Protection records placed numerous high-profile individuals on board. With the 2026 releases under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a staggering 3.5 million pages of records came to light. While the presence of a name does not inherently establish criminal wrongdoing, it provides a verified map of his orbit. Let's look at the verified mentions. Prince Andrew, the British royal, was accused by Virginia Giuffre of sexual assault under Epstein's direction, ultimately settling a civil lawsuit in 2022 for $500,000 without admitting liability. Leon Black, co-founder of Apollo Global Management, was referred to as Mr. Big in emails and paid Epstein $158 million between 2012 and 2017 for tax advice. Steve Bannon, the political strategist, exchanged thousands of texts with Epstein regarding European politics, even advising Epstein to start a center for human trafficking to repair his image. Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, the Emirati billionaire and former CEO of DP World, appeared over 4,700 times in the files. Documents suggest his name was used via power of attorney to secretly help Epstein purchase his second private island, Great St. James. He resigned from his executive positions in February 2026. Woody Allen, the filmmaker, was a frequent guest whose daughter was connected to the president of Bard College by Epstein. Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, was used by Epstein to connect with tech billionaires. Former U.S. Presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump both maintained social ties in the 1990s and early 2000s and appear in flight logs and social photographs, though Trump fell out with Epstein prior to 2005. Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail executive, was unmasked following redaction controversies in early 2026, revealing the FBI had internally labeled him as a potential co-conspirator, though he was never charged. How does the law define the exploitation of human beings? To comprehend the severity of the 2019 federal indictment, we have to look at the stark differences between state prostitution laws and federal sex trafficking statutes. In 2006, the state of Florida charged Epstein with state-level solicitation of prostitution. State laws generally treat prostitution as a localized, transactional offense with minor penalties. But federal law elevates these crimes to severe felonies when they involve crossing state borders or organized enterprises. Federal prosecutors rely on two primary legal instruments. First, the Mann Act. Originally passed in 1910, it criminalizes the transportation of any person in interstate or foreign commerce for illegal sexual activity. Second, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This modern statute targets the enterprise of trafficking. Crucially, if the victim is under the age of 18, prosecutors do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. The age of the victim alone is legally sufficient to establish the crime of sex trafficking. The 2019 New York indictment against Epstein represents a masterclass in modern trafficking prosecution. Instead of focusing on isolated incidents, federal prosecutors analyzed Epstein's operation as a complex criminal syndicate. Epstein utilized an entourage and victim recruiter model, paying initial victims $200 in cash to recruit their high school peers. This method weaponized the victims' own socioeconomic vulnerabilities against each other. To dismantle this, prosecutors used tactics traditionally reserved for the mafia, applying immense legal pressure to the entourage of schedulers, pilots, and recruiters to testify against the central figurehead. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is a chronicle of justice deferred, a testament to how legal systems can be manipulated by those with unlimited resources. In March 2005, Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Ryder launched an investigation after a 14-year-old girl reported abuse. Detectives quickly identified over 30 underage victims. Yet, Palm Beach State Attorney Barry Krischer refused to file severe felony charges directly, routing the case to a state grand jury, which returned a drastically minimized indictment. Suspecting a cover-up, Chief Ryder bravely referred the case to the FBI. By May 2007, the FBI drafted a 60-count federal indictment. But Epstein's lawyers bypassed standard channels. U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta engaged in closed-door negotiations that culminated in a sweetheart deal. The September 2007 non-prosecution agreement. Epstein agreed to plead guilty in state court, serve just 13 months on a lenient work release program, and register as a sex offender. In exchange, he and 4 unnamed co-conspirators received sweeping federal immunity. The victims were never notified, a severe violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Justice remained dormant until November 2018, when investigative journalist Julie K. Brown published the Perversion of Justice series in the Miami Herald. Public outrage forced the DOJ to act. On July 6, 2019, the FBI arrested Epstein on federal charges of sex trafficking, successfully arguing the Florida agreement did not bind prosecutors in New York. He was finally locked behind bars. The battle to expose Epstein required the relentless efforts of journalists, police chiefs, and civil rights attorneys who risked their careers to dismantle a conspiracy protected by the highest echelons of power. Let's review the key figures. Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite and daughter of media baron Robert Maxwell, convicted in 2021 as the primary recruiter and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney who negotiated the highly controversial 2007 sweetheart deal. He later served as Secretary of Labor, but resigned in 2019 due to the massive backlash. Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York who led the aggressive 2019 federal prosecution, finally placing Epstein in a jail cell. Michael Ryder, the former chief of the Palm Beach Police Department who initiated the very first inquiry in 2005 and bravely handed the case to the FBI when local state attorneys stalled. Barry Krischer, the Palm Beach State Attorney heavily criticized for sending the 2005 case to a grand jury rather than filing direct charges. Brad Edwards, the managing partner at Edwards Henderson who represented Epstein survivors for over a decade, instrumental in challenging the corrupt plea deal and securing hundreds of millions in bank settlements. Paul Castle, the University of Utah law professor and victims' rights expert who litigated pro bono to prove the government violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Following Epstein's death, the legal crosshairs locked onto the woman described by prosecutors as the mastermind of the operation. On July 2, 2020, the FBI arrested Ghislaine Maxwell at a secluded property in New Hampshire. The trial commenced in late 2021. The prosecution presented Maxwell not as a passive observer, but as a proactive, criminally responsible participant who normalized the abuse and groomed vulnerable girls. Defense attorneys attempted to portray her as another victim of his manipulation, a convenient stand-in for the dead billionaire. On December 30th, 2021, after 40 hours of deliberation, the jury found Maxwell guilty on 5 counts, including the sex trafficking of a minor. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. In a bizarre 2026 postscript, Maxwell invoked her Fifth Amendment right during a deposition before the House Oversight Committee, with her attorney stating she would only testify if granted clemency by Donald Trump. A trafficking ring of this magnitude requires a sophisticated financial infrastructure. While the criminal courts handled the perpetrators, the civil courts systematically dismantled the financial institutions that turn a blind eye. Following his death, Epstein's estate, valued at over $577 million, was targeted by dozens of lawsuits from survivors. To resolve these claims, the estate established the Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, paying out a total of $121 million to 135 survivors before closing in 2021. Furthermore, the U.S. Virgin Islands filed a civil racketeering lawsuit against the estate, alleging Epstein used his private islands to conceal crimes behind shell companies. In November 2022, the estate settled for $105 million, plus half the proceeds from the eventual sale of the islands. But the banks were next. Epstein banked with JP Chase from 1998 to 2013, and then Deutsche Bank until 2018. Both faced massive lawsuits. JP Chase was accused of keeping Epstein as a client despite internal warnings of human trafficking and massive cash withdrawals. In 2023, they settled, paying $290 million to a class of Epstein survivors and an additional $75 million to the Virgin Islands. Deutsche Bank was accused of onboarding Epstein fully aware of his sex offender status, choosing profit over following the law. They settled for $75 million to a class of survivors, marking one of the largest sex trafficking settlements with a bank in U.S. history. The circumstances of Epstein's death represent a catastrophic failure of federal custody. At 6:30 a.m. on August 10, 2019, guards at the Metropolitan Correctional Center discovered Epstein unresponsive in his cell, kneeling with a bedsheet tied around his neck. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The medical examiner and a DOJ Inspector General report officially ruled the cause of death as suicide by hanging. But the viral propagation of the Epstein didn't kill himself meme was fueled by undeniably severe institutional negligence, what Attorney General William Barr described as a perfect storm of screw-ups. The two guards assigned to the unit fell asleep for 3 hours, skipped mandatory checks, and intentionally falsified prison logs. They later received a slap on the wrist of just 100 hours of community service. 2 security cameras pointing at the cell malfunctioned, and a third produced unusable footage. Adding fuel to the fire, forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, hired by Epstein's brother, publicly disputed the suicide ruling. He noted Epstein had 3 fractures in his neck, including the hyoid bone, arguing this was more consistent with homicidal strangulation. While the New York Medical Examiner firmly rejected these claims, the conflicting pathology and guard negligence spawned massive conspiracy theories. Claims of assassination by intelligence agencies or body doubles remain entirely unverified speculation, but the public's trust in the institution was shattered. For years, the public demanded access to the unredacted truth. In late 2025, a rare moment of bipartisan unity in the U.S. Congress forced the final doors of secrecy open. Following a discharge petition that bypassed committee gridlock, the House passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act by a staggering 427 to 1 margin. It was immediately signed into law, legally mandating the DOJ to release all unclassified records, prohibiting redactions except to protect minor victims. On January 30th, 2026, the DOJ complied, releasing 3.5 million pages of documents, 180,000 images, and 2,000 videos. This unprecedented data dump stripped the anonymity from Epstein's global enablers. Documents revealed an unsigned, limited power of attorney used to deliberately disguise Emirati billionaire Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem's identity when purchasing Great St. James in 2016, leading to his resignation. In February 2026, Representatives Ro Khanna and Thomas Massey visited the Justice Department, forcing the unmasking of further names like Nicola Caputo and Salvatore Nuara, proving the pressure was far from over. Across Europe, figures like former Norwegian Prime Minister Thorbjorn Jagland were charged with aggravated corruption based on ties revealed in the files. To truly comprehend the scale of this conspiracy, we have to look at the master timeline of evasion and exposure. September 1974. Epstein is hired to teach at the Dalton School without a degree, pivoting to Wall Street by 1976. August 1981. He founds Intercontinental Assets Group, eventually securing his billionaire connection to Leslie Wexner. March 2005. Palm Beach police investigate a 14-year-old's report of abuse, uncovering dozens of local victims. July 2006. A state grand jury indicts Epstein on a minor solicitation charge. Frustrated, the police chief refers the case to the FBI. May 2007, the FBI drafts a 60-count federal indictment, but U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta bypasses standard channels. September 2007, Acosta signs the corrupt, non-prosecution agreement, granting federal immunity to Epstein and his co-conspirators. June 2008, Epstein pleads guilty to state charges, serving just 13 months on work release. November 2018, the Miami Herald publishes its explosive Perversion of Justice series, igniting public outrage and reopening the federal case. July 6, 2019, Epstein is arrested by the FBI on federal sex trafficking charges and remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center. August 10, 2019, Epstein is found dead in his jail cell. It is officially ruled a suicide. January 2020, the U.S. Virgin Islands files a civil racketeering lawsuit against the Epstein estate. July 2020 and December 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell is arrested and later convicted on 5 counts of sex trafficking. November 2022, the Virgin Islands settles with the Epstein estate for $105 million. September 2023, J.P. Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank settle civil lawsuits for a combined $440 million. November 2025, the Epstein Files Transparency Act is signed into law. January 2026, the DOJ releases 3.5 million pages of unredacted files, triggering global corporate resignations and new corruption charges. For those questioning the validity of this dossier, every claim presented here is backed by highly reliable, publicly verifiable sources. The bedrock of this investigation rests on Tier 1 legal documents. The text of the 2025 Epstein Files Transparency Act, Public Law 119-38. The November 2020 Doge OPR report detailing the mechanics of the 2008 Sweetheart Deal, the July 2019 SDNY federal indictment, and the unsealed 2024 Customs and Border Protection flight logs. We also lean on Tier 2 investigative journalism, specifically the award-winning Miami Herald Perversion of Justice series, without which this case may have stayed buried forever. Finally, Tier 3 peer-reviewed analyses from the Northwestern Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology provided the legal framework explaining the complex entourage prosecution strategy. The Jeffrey Epstein dossier transcends the criminal actions of a single man. It acts as a glaring, indisputable indictment of the systemic architectures of power, wealth, and complicity that allowed a global sex trafficking ring to operate unchecked for decades. From the catastrophic failures of state prosecutors in 2006 to the unlawful federal Sweetheart Deal in 2007, the justice system repeatedly prioritized elite protection over the rights of vulnerable minors. However, the relentless perseverance of the survivors, aided by dogged investigative journalists and steadfast civil litigators, ultimately forced a historical reckoning. The resulting 2019 federal indictment, the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell, the hundreds of millions extracted from complicit megabanks, and the ultimate unsealing of 3.5 million documents in 2026 signify a paradigm shift in global accountability. The legacy of the Epstein files is clear. Extreme wealth can buy access, and it can buy silence, but it can no longer guarantee permanent immunity. Did you like this video? Subscribe to the Crime Train and hit the notification bell to get notified on our next thrilling true crime video. Until then, keep chilling on the Crime Train.